God dwells in you. Let us pray. Oremos por la familia humana. Oh Dios, tú nos hiciste a tu propia imagen. Mira en tu compasión a toda la familia humana. Quita el odio y la arrogancia que nos corrompen el corazón. Derrumba las barreras que nos separan. Únenos en vínculos de amor y actúa a través de nuestra lucha y confusión a fin de cumplir tus propósitos en la tierra, para que a su debido tiempo todas las naciones y razas te sirvan en armonía alrededor de tu trono celestial. Amen. It's a prayer for the human family. O God, you made us in your own image. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. And work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Amen. Welcome. If you are new at All Saints or visiting with us this morning, great to have you here. And if you'd like to be kept appraised of future events and all the different things that are going on here at All Saints Church, there are some green contact sheets near the door. Please take a moment to give us your contact information. Also, on the lawn, there is a welcome table where you can pick up a red welcome bag. That includes a welcome card. There's lots of welcome materials you can take with you and fill out and return or fill it out on the spot. It is wonderful to have you here. Everyone turn around and wave at the camera. It is great to have everyone here who's streaming around the country and around the world. Wonderful to have you here too. At all times, we put our faith into action here at All Saints, and every week we pick one or two things to focus that action as a community. And this week we're writing to our state senators and assembly members to advocate for strengthening the California Earned Income Tax Credit in the 2017-18 state budget. Despite the fact that California is the sixth richest economy in the world, nearly 1 in 4 children in this state live in poverty. Child poverty is a moral and an economic crisis for our state. The California Earned Income Tax Credit is one of the most powerful anti-poverty programs in this country. And so please, before you leave, visit the action table by the door and sign these important letters to your state senator and assembly members. Also want to thank you for all of you who, by your pledges and gifts, support the ministry of All Saints Church. It is never too late to pledge. It is never too late to give. We have a huge amount of work to do, and we need the generosity of everyone here and everyone watching us online. There's a little donate button on your screen, and please don't be shy about clicking on it and making a gift to All Saints Church. And so if you have made a pledge and you have given to the church, thank you so much for doing that. And if you haven't yet, please see me or any other member of the staff, and we'll get you hooked up with a pledge card so you can have some skin in the game in the work that we're doing here as a community. I've only been here 7 months, going on 8 months, and yet one of the things that it has been easy for me to see is who out in the community is the real deal, who is rolling up their sleeves and being out in the streets and standing up for justice and standing up for the values of their faith in powerful ways. And it looks like everywhere I look, I see our guest this morning, Professor Najeeba Syeed. She just said that she's on sabbatical, but I think the initial purpose of sabbatical, meaning rest, has been somehow lost on her, because what I see you doing is far from restful, and yet she always has this incredible energy and glow about her, and it is this work of justice that she does. She's a professor at Claremont School of Theology. She's director of the Center for Global Peace Building. She's a regular blogger for Muslim Voices and Feminist.com and Huffington Post, and you might have seen her in the LA Times and NPR and PBS. She is a sought-out advisor for state, federal, and White House initiatives and international conflicts, and Guam, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, India, and France, and she is recognized as a leader in peace building for reducing violence in schools and in the area of interracial gang conflicts, and she was about 10 years ago named Southern California Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year. And she is here to talk with us, and I know she is a longtime friend of All Saints Church. She's here to talk with us about what intersectionality and interfaith relations looks like in healing justice and in resistance, and also to talk about feminism and Islam. And so at this point, I am going to sit down, and I'm just going to ask you to please welcome Professor Najeeba Syeed. Get my stuff out of your way here.
Thank you. What an honor and a pleasure. I've addressed this audience before, but now under the direction and leadership of Rector Mike Kinnaman, I'm so really blessed. So the funny thing is, if someone says they see you everywhere doing social justice work, that means they must also be everywhere doing social justice work. So we might say it takes one to know one. So I'm actually going to start off with a poem today. I was challenged, there was an interfaith iftar earlier this week, so I was challenged to perform poetry. So I'm going to open with a poem about peace. And I actually wrote it, so. The most beautiful peace is made when no one is looking. The most profound peace is made without fanfare. The most lasting peace when hearts simply love, when animosity was prescribed by every form and figure. A loving peace disrupts, erupts power that was built, protruding onto soft human bodies. Peace is always messy, as birth, serenity a myth. Why rahma, or mercy, derived from the womb, if done right, is never easy nor quick. Catch compassion as she is born. We made her together. In Arabic, the root word for mercy is rahama, the same as it is in Hebrew, and this word actually comes from the word womb. So there is something profoundly encapsulated in that term of rahma, of compassion. It is a womb-like compassion, and that kind of compassion is one that is engaged, one that is radical, and one that is embodied. So one of the things I wanted to have us do today is to take away the notion that peace is something that is easily done, or that civility is something that we should promote without the notion of how disorder and disruption are sometimes holy tasks as well. So Dr. King warned us about this kind of peace and warned us about this kind of perspective. He said to be concerned that you should not be someone who is more devoted to order than to justice, someone who is more devoted to order than justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So I mention that because a lot of people will say, well, you're a peacemaker. And I say, I am a peacemaker. And I am a peacemaker because of my tradition, and I'm a peace researcher. However, peace has often been used against many communities. Peace has been weaponized as a tool to subdue dissent and difference. So when I talk about peace, I often start my processes of engagement between people in conflict, and I often work in conflicts that are actually violent. I ask now two questions. I used to have complex, elaborate processes. You can read my academic articles, they're in there. One of them is on Pasadena, actually, having run an organization here for about 6 years. But I asked two fundamental questions. Who is human and what is sacred? And the reason I've come to these two questions is that one of my intellectual mentors, Elise Boulding, said, we live in a time when it is not a clash of civilizations, a clash of religions, a clash of communities. We live in a time where we can participate and be producers of cultures of peace or cultures of violence. So any community, any religion, any person is equally capable of peace or equally capable of violence. And this is a fundamental intervention that we have to begin to think about, because once we put a community, a person, or an individual on the pedestal of being beyond making violence or only being violent, we have in fact created an impossibility for any human condition to change. And so I think of my work right now as someone who's invested in building cultures of violence, cultures of peace. That is not, please do not record that. I think of myself as someone who is interested in building cultures of peace and standing up against cultures of violence. So why do we ask these two questions, who is human and what is sacred? We ask the first question, who is human, because we live in a time where racism, structural racism, and as John Galton would say, structural violence, are built so deeply into the DNA of our society. So we live in a time where sociologists have found something called an empathy gap, where if individuals are presented with a picture of an African American experiencing pain, their response is that that individual does not feel pain in the same way as other humans. This is sociologically what is embedded into this culture. So the structural racism and the structural violence find their way into the very conscious of how people construct who is human. And I've had to work with people in conflicts for them to really reflect on who is in their category of human and who is not. And so I ask you today, when you go into the world, who is human? We live in a time where citizenship is code for who is human. We live in a time when this culture is built on the dehumanization of many communities. And do you have a hand in that dehumanization process? Are we partners in dehumanization? That is something we have to ask ourselves. So this is a fundamental question that I have come to find has its way in when we do interreligious, interfaith work and intersectional work. We have to interrogate not just the individual constructs, but the social norms that have been built and this society which has been built on this notion of who and how humanity is manifested. And this is a very dangerous trope. There is a test that's now been given around, it's called ascension dehumanization, where it shows the traditional Darwinian evolution process. And what we found is some individuals, when asked, where do they fall on this line? We found that some individuals feel Muslims are not fully human either. And so this ascension dehumanization process has been replicated in studies across multiple cultures because oppression and violence are based on a vision of dehumanizing the other. Every time we have seen war and violence rise, the representation of the object of war and violence has always been one in which there is a dehumanized representation. Think about almost every form of war across nations. So I say this today because I often think when we come to the table to do intersectional, interfaith work, the greatest work we have to often do is on ourselves first. And the recognition of the product of the cultures and structures of violence that we have participated in. And it's important to understand that one of the reasons we need to do interfaith work intersectionally is that not all of us derive our religious identity alone as the great source of our operating in the world. For some of us, our culture, our language, and other forms of identity are absolutely as important or inextricably linked with our religious identity. So for me, as a South Asian Muslim, my identity when I come to the table isn't just any Muslim coming to the table. I'll often tell my students which Muslim is at the table, which Jewish person is at the table, which agnostic is at the table. Because if you look at the Muslim community in the United States, we are among the most diverse religious communities in the country. So if you construct an interreligious engagement around a particular issue, the concerns that someone may have from a particular cultural background may not reflect every Muslim's perspective. So our internal religious and racial diversity are profoundly important in this work. So the second question that I ask is, what is sacred? And I think this is really important because we live in a time when it doesn't have to be just a religious orientation that brings you into this work. It doesn't have to be just a God-centered notion that brings you into this work. So I work with those who have no religious identity, but everyone has something sacred. What is it that you're going to leave your house with if it's burning? That's what's sacred to you, right? And I began to think of teaching more and more in my own work the intervention that so many indigenous scholars do, which is to think about the earth as sacred as well. And this is an incredible notion. My students now, every class I teach, they have Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, and indigenous scholarship that they have to read. Because one of the things that happened when they began to see the earth as sacred and non-humans as sacred is it opened up the capacity to do interfaith work far more holistically than it was done just for me or my community. They began to see the theologies of interdependence, the notion that my dignity is tied to the manifestation of your dignity, and that the resources of this earth are tied to my capacity to share them with you. Because if the whole earth is sacred, then in fact, our combined work is very, very much a part of this process. And here I wanted to talk a little bit about another aspect that is tied to this notion of structural violence and what is sacred. And it's the rise in toxic masculinities. So I'm doing a little academic discussion today and a little practical. And there's profound scholarship on the notion of toxic masculinities. So Enlo says that she ties it to nationalism. She says nationalism sprung from masculinized memory, masculinized humiliation, and masculinized hope. And Nagel takes us further and she says, she argues that women are relegated to minor, often symbolic roles in nationalist movements, either as icons of nationhood to be elevated or defended, or as the booty or spoils of war, to be denigrated and disgraced. In either case, the real actors are men who are defending their freedom, their honor, their homeland, and their women. So what is sacred can actually also be used in a weaponized way. Religion can be a healing agent, but religion can also be used to vilify and move hate forward. And the reason I mentioned this notion of toxic masculinities is we live in a time where a notion of nationalism is tied to the manifestation of leadership that looks at violence against women no longer, we were able to finally bring it as a problem, but now no longer is it a problem, it's celebrated. It's celebrated, our culture is beginning to celebrate it, right? So we live in a time where intersectionality and what is sacred, where you can elevate, in fact, a notion of a nation that celebrates the violence against women, and that the masculinity that portrays that, and that masculinity is not tied to one gender. That masculinity, that toxic masculinity notion is something that can be found in many, many different ways, but manifested. So I wanted to tie this in a little bit to this notion of intersectionality, keeping and being aware of cultures, being aware of race, and being aware and continuously aware of how women are a part, and the bodies of women, as Susan Thistlethwaite says, are often the war zones for where these cultural wars happen between the notions of peace and the notions of violence. So if we think about peace and we problematize it, we think about this notion of cultures of peace and cultures of violence. What does religion, what does spirituality bring? It helps us think through and theologize and consider, how is it that we can be embodiments of those who do sacred resistance work? And there are 3 tools I wanted to leave you with that come from our tradition, and they're ethical orientations. The first is an ethic of hope. So when you're taking on a whole culture of violence, think about nearly every prophet, whether they were of the Abrahamic or other traditions, they were essentially looking at cultures of violence because they would sit with those who were the most marginalized. No great religion grew in the beginning with the most powerful. No great religion grew with those that had everything. All great prophets sat with those who were physically marginalized in any society. So this ethic of hope is something we need to imbibe from our traditions. To take on a whole culture of violence means that one must see something different than what is happening in front of you. And this is a tool that the spiritualization of conflict, the spiritualization of struggle brings to the table. It brings a resilience and a strength to say, I am going to invest in something that will not bring me back money, that will not bring me back power, that will not get me invitations into the halls of power, because I want to be in the space with those that are holiest and most sacred. So that's an irrational choice. It works against the transactional notion that justice is achieved by winds of power, in which the scales of justice mean that I benefit individually, that I get something out of this. So part of working intersectionally is to stand up with those with whom you get no benefit from. Guess what? Maybe you even get vilified for that. To be an ally means you must risk something bodily. To be an ally means you must risk something intellectually. To be an ally means you must risk something spiritually. And one of the other things that our traditions give us is this notion of humility. And one of the other things when we work intersectionally is, this is sort of funny to say in a Christian context, is to begin to move away from the notion of the savior complex. Right? I don't know how, we could talk about Christology later, but this notion of one single savior coming in to change the condition of a people. This is a story that is a beautiful story, but none of those prophets even acted unto themselves. No great leader, and this is tied to that notion of masculinities. When we have a notion that we're waiting for one single male to come and save us all, it has found its way, and this predates Christianity, it has found its way into this notion of humility. So when we want to serve others, an ally is someone who decenters themselves and centers the voices and the struggles and the work of those who are directly affected by an issue. An ally is someone who amplifies the work, the efforts, the stories of those who are directly working on the issue and are affected by it. An ally is someone who is a profound listener, who, when they show up, asks, how can I serve? Not this is what you should do, or I have some ideas for you. I have some really good ideas I'd like to share with you. An ally is like, in our tradition, Prophet Solomon was, when there was an ant that was, with her large group. She was walking, I guess ants walk or crawl, I'm not sure what they do, saunter. So they were walking, and Sulaiman, in our tradition, Solomon, he had the gift from God to hear the voices of animals and understand them. So he heard this ant, the stories in the Quran, he heard this ant pleading, hearing the army of Solomon come. So what he does is he changes the course of his army to make sure that the ants do not lose their lives. So these are tiny little ants. The reason I love that story is it says any of us, first of all, can be an ant. All of our voices are important. But actually, it's the listening of Sulaiman that is profound to me. So when we go into spaces, it's this ability to listen to every voice and not to determine the significance or insignificance of a voice based on my calculus of power. So it's listening and being there and changing courses of history through listening. One of the beautiful aspects of Prophet Muhammad's mission in the Quran, it tells us he is rahma, a mercy to all, and not just to Muslims, but to all communities. So it's not that I say my prophet is a mercy to me and a wrath upon you. But in a time when interreligious violence is at its height, one of the things we need to begin to think about is, what are the theologies of wholeness in our different traditions? There is no greater abstracted notion than that of peace and love. If I go to another sermon of anyone in any tradition who says, my religion is a religion of peace, but I ask my students, what does mercy and compassion and peace, what do they look like? What do they sound like? What do they feel like? Where do they come from? Because so often we put this notion of the pursuit of peace and justice in the hands of someone else. That someone else will do that. Someone else will stand up for undocumented individuals. Someone else will stand with communities. And what we find is when we begin to see that part of our traditions isn't a uniformity of humanity, but a consensus that everyone deserves a full participation in society, and that wholeness is the foundation of our continuous work together, then there is something that is really beautiful. Not only do we have this wholeness, we have hope, humility, and wholeness, but we develop courage. Uncanny, irrational, hopefully strategically placed courage. And this is something that I wanted to share with you. Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, in addition to being told that his mission was mercy on earth, there's also another mission and part of this. A man came to the Messenger of Allah and said, what is the best jihad? So the word jihad has been translated into English as holy war. In Arabic, it means actually exertion. So you may know some Muslim men, one of my students is named Jihad, because to us, it doesn't mean what it often is translated into the media. It means some form of exertion. And actually, so this man came to the Prophet Muhammad and said, what is the best jihad or exertion? And the Prophet's answer was not to fight physically. His answer was a word of truth in front of a tyrannical ruler. A word of truth in front of a tyrannical ruler. So part of my responsibility as a Muslim, my exertion, the best exertion, is actually to go in front of a tyrannical ruler and to speak the word of truth. And this word of truth is very profound because it doesn't say that the word of truth is a Muslim word or that the person affected is from my tradition or that the tyrannical ruler may be of my tradition and still I must stand. So right now, when Christians around the world are experiencing violence, this is a time when actually it's this incredible rub of the very thing that is used is also sometimes the source of beauty, where religion that is weaponized for violence is also, for many of us, the basis of our capacity for compassion. So how do we begin to have conversations and explore together within and across our traditions what supports cultures of violence and what promotes and builds cultures of peace? So for me, this notion of being and with others, being in spaces, is that word of truth in front of a tyrannical ruler takes many, many forms. Whether it's marches, whether it's protests, whether it's a letter to my congressperson, whether it's standing next to someone that no one else in my community will stand next to. So I want you to think about in your own work and in your own world, how are you and I manifesting and becoming producers of hope, embodiments of humility, pursuing with others the notion of wholeness, working to unpack our own individually constructed, depending on our background, our own really deep embedded notions of who is human and what is sacred. Because unless that work is done, sometimes intersectional allyship work can be a form of violence itself. Sometimes we can get together to do work and actually take a cause backwards if we're not manifesting and doing the work. And the work is lifelong. The work that we do together is as important as the work that I do on myself. The work that I do with you in this space is as important as the work as I do with the Muslim community. So when I come and often will give these kinds of lectures, these are the same notions, the same curricula that I teach at the mosques that I work with and in the communities that I work with. So when we have to deal with interracial issues in the Muslim community, standing up for the notion of intersectionality, that religion is important, but we're not going to get anywhere advancing, for instance, just civil liberties if we don't deal with issues of mass incarceration when one of the largest Muslim communities in the United States is also the African American Muslim community. So these issues are constructed not just by religion, but also by these other intersectionalities. But at an even deeper notion, these issues become Muslim issues because anytime a tyrannical ruler has used their power, it is actually those who have a connection to their spiritualization of struggle to be able to stand up irrationally and say, I may lose everything, but I am here. And what's most powerful is when we're not just there by ourselves, but when we are there together communally. Thank you so much for your time today.
We do have time for some questions. I know Rosemary is here. We have some others. Are there? Good. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much. When you were speaking about cultures of peace and cultures of violence, I couldn't help but think of tribalism. And it seems like tribalism is a form of that would define who is human and also what is sacred. And I also think of tribalism as being very implicit, like deeply embedded in the psychology and the sociology of any group. How do you penetrate that? How do you undo tribalism?
So I think that's a really good question. There are actually a couple of answers to them, and I have multiple hats or scarves. So what I would say is, I think that the Quran tells us that, the Quran says that we have created you in different, and it mentions tribes as one of the differences, and that the challenge of humanity is to know one another. So there is a divine purpose in the difference of humanity. So it is something to be not just celebrated, but the human challenge, I'm answering this theologically from a Muslim perspective, is that tribes are also one form of identity and kinship. So in some ways, the challenge to us is not to eradicate the tribes themselves, but to understand how that difference brings with it some gifts that can be celebrated and worked with together. So that's one way. The Quran says ta'arafu, to know one another. So that's the challenge to human beings, the sacred challenge. And that's one of the things that actually spirituality and religion can bring to the table. It's not a transcendence of identity, but it's a capacity to understand that those sources of identity are themselves sacred. So that's one way to answer it. The other is that some tribal customs are sometimes sources of peacemaking in ways that religions have not been. So Muhammad Abu Nimer's work on this notion of sulh, of peacemaking, looking at some Arab tribes, he talked about the notion of cultures of peace sometimes coming from tribal practices. So a lot of times I think there may be demonization of cultural practices and celebration of religious practices, or the opposite. But I think it's important to look at all forms of practice as some ways that culture is manifested. So sometimes when I work with a community and I will work on the religious notion of peacemaking, then sometimes we get into some of the tribal practices, and what we find is those are also sources for peacemaking. So I wanted to point out that any form of cultural commonality can be a wall, but it can also be a bridge.
I have a question here.
Yes.
Your question about who is human brings to mind my racist father. I grew up in the 50s in the deep South, the deep segregated South. And he would say, well, yes, the African Americans, or he'd call them something else. Of course they're human, but they're less than human. That is a relative term. There are degrees of full humanity.
Well, that's where the state is very important to keep in mind, because the state enshrined the measurement of African Americans in ways that are incredibly, it's even hard to talk about, but this notion of who is human is part of our legislative history in the United States. Who can vote, who is property. And I want to point out that the responsibility and the pathology is in those systems. The pathology or the sickness is not in those that are dehumanized, it is in the structure itself. Because what can happen when a system creates these categories is it begins to use language that is dehumanizing. And what I want to point out here is the sickness is actually in the structural violence itself. The sickness is racism. The evil, the theodicy here is racism. The evil is the actual naming of this category that we have mentioned. So I want to point out here, because I think we have to talk about when religion has been a handmaiden in these structures of violence. And we have to begin to ask those questions. So if it is found in the state's language, if racism is quantified in the state's language, how has the pulpit been a part of that? So I would recommend some of the good work on the civil rights movement around the theologies that supported. A lot of us look at the theologies of liberation, but there were theologies that supported, as you were saying, there were theologies that supported very racist perspectives. And not just racism, but racism that found its way into structural and individual violence as justification. So I want to point that out because I think sometimes when we think about intersectionality, sometimes the process of looking at religion, we have to also look at when religion has been weaponized, utilized, formalized as a tool. And I think this is a process of self-reflection for really for each denomination to also begin to consider. And something that when I work within the Muslim community, we have a lot of work to do in the immigrant Muslim community. There has been some really powerful work done by a younger generation talking about what it meant to be black in the Muslim Students Association. What did it mean to be within our own community? How is racism structurally already socially conditioned, but also how has religion played into this notion? The other point I want to make about this is who is pious and who's impious. So I would recommend the work of Joshua Pattison also on it's on heathenization of Native populations, Asian American populations, and others in California, in which our state structurally utilizing religion and other economic systems essentially justified very, very racist practices, and some of these are not that old. I want to remind everyone that the last thing I'm going to say is that if nothing else, we have to understand that there used to be a notion that time moved to a progressive end, that people will say, I can't believe such a thing is happening now. And what I want to point out is, one thing religion tells us is the tyrant is always possible. The tyrant is always possible, and the work of justice is something that must keep us awake constantly. And I want to point that out because I think what can happen is we can fall asleep at the wheel with this notion that time itself, there's a linear sense of time, that things will get better just because time goes on. In fact, things can get worse because cosmetically they look like they're better, but the structures are taking the time to actually work harder. So I want us to really think about these notions of how spirituality and religion can actually activate us on a constant pursuit for justice, to understand that that is part of the reason for us on earth, is to be able to continuously and continually work on this pursuit of justice. And as we said, rahma, this notion of a radical compassion. Anything else?
I think we have time for one more really quick.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
You've talked about the state and also religion, and I'm wondering about your perspective on how science has contributed to this.
It's such a good question. Such a good question. I've been working with my students on that too, because a lot of times secularities or science or scientism are considered the answer for everything. And so I didn't have time to go into the conversation around dehumanization, but one of the things that I have been working with my students on is just the histories of research in the United States, and how, for instance, if you look at the history of gynecology, how African American women's bodies were utilized in that process. So I think when I was using this notion of humanity, I think that's a spiritual orientation, but we could argue that it's found its way into research and into a medical model of how human beings are constructed and how social change should happen. So I think it finds its way into social justice language too. And thank you for asking that question, because a lot of times science is seen as the answer, and every idea has a genealogy. Whether it is a religious identity, what the idea of a state has genealogy. So I really encourage all of us, one of the first signs of fascism is anti-intellectualism, and I don't mean elite intellectualism, I mean just factual understanding. So your question is really important because I think what happens is suddenly we're going to see science continuously weaponized for racism again. And I would point out another area that's very problematic has been environmental justice, having done some of that work in California, where communities of color will have the most harm perpetrated by the state as well through the placement of very toxic chemical plants or toxic waste dumps. So we've now begun to see how science, which appears to be a quote-unquote neutral entity, can also carry or be utilized for agendas. So I can go on. There are many experiments around the history of medical experiments in the United States that were utilized particularly against the African American community. But I really encourage you to read and make sure that we all understand that the genealogy of any idea has a history, and that not everyone is equally benefited, not everyone equally benefits from an idea. So I think that's really important as well. Advances have come at the cost very often of certain communities, or those advances are not advances for everyone. I think that's a really important question. Thank you so much for asking that. I think we are done now? Okay.
Thank you so much.